Welcome to today's IHME seminar. Come right down. Thank you. All right. Well, as you know, we work with a lot of data here at IHME. We write massive amounts of code. So today's seminar, very applicable and very important for us. Randall LeVeque is going to talk today about reproducibility, code sharing, and open source software development. He's going to discuss a variety of techniques and tools that are available to us to improve reproducibility in research. Randall LeVeque joins us from the Applied Mathematics Department. He's a professor here at the University of Washington. Randall received his PhD in computer science from Stanford University in 1982. He's a fellow of the Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics and a fellow of the American Mathematical Society. So, Randy, glad to have you here.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. See if I can get rid of this. There we go. Okay, so by all means, feel free to interrupt me if you have questions as you go along. I'll try to not run on too long, so there'll be some time for questions at the end as well. But if you have questions, please feel free to stop me. So what I'd like to talk about is reproducibility and various aspects of it and open source software development that we've been working on. But to tell you a little bit about who I am, first of all, I've been at UW since 1985 in the Applied Math Department. I work mostly on numerical methods for wave propagation problems of various sorts, solving partial differential equations that model wave propagation. And for the past 20 years or so, we've been developing an open source software package that implements a lot of these methods called CLAWPAC, which stands for Conservation Laws Package, because a lot of these equations model things like conservation of mass and momentum in various fluid dynamics systems. And there are lots of applications that this sort of software has been applied to. It was originally developed for handling things like shock waves and very strong waves in aerodynamics and astrophysics type applications. One thing that might be of interest to people here is I've been working on a project with Dr. David Cook and others at the VA hospital on traumatic brain injury and brain injury that's caused by blast waves. That is a major problem among veterans these days. But another aspect of what I've been looking at that I'll say a bit about today is looking at geophysical flows and hazards and tsunami modeling in particular, just to give you an idea of the sort of things that we're looking at, and also because looking at this kind of problem has led to part of my interest in reproducibility and making sure that the code that we develop can be used by others and that we can justify the work that we've done when we work on problems that have policy implications and that people are actually applying to the real world. So another aspect of this work that's been in the news recently is landslide modeling. A former student of mine, Dave George, now works at the USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory, and he and Dick Iverson have been developing a version of our code that models debris flows and landslides. If you're interested in this, there was a couple of segments on King 5 News recently about the modeling that they've been doing of this event. I can share these slides afterwards, and all of the green links are things that you can click on if you're interested in following up on any of the things I talk about. But I've been personally more involved in the tsunami modeling, which is a major potential issue here in the Pacific Northwest. A lot of people around Seattle don't think too much about earthquakes, but we do have the possibility of a magnitude 9 earthquake here, something similar to what happened in Japan 3 years ago or in Sumatra in 2004. There's a subduction zone along the west coast here going from Northern California up to British Columbia. And about every 500 years or so, there's a magnitude 9 earthquake and tsunami, huge tsunami generated as a result. The last one was in 1700, and it's been a fairly quiet subduction zone since then, but it's definitely going to happen again. They can trace back over the last 10,000 years or so and see that approximately every 500 years on average, we have a large magnitude 9. So a lot of the work that we've been doing recently has been working with the Emergency Management Division of the state of Washington and DNR, Department of Natural Resources, on doing some modeling of the Washington coast. So I'll just show you one sort of simulation of Grays Harbor here and Ocean Shores, if you're familiar with that. It's a community that's on a very low-lying sand spit. There's a lot of houses and hotels on that peninsula now. And if a magnitude 9 happens offshore, then what happens is that within about 40 minutes after the earthquake, you've got 5 meters of water or more sweeping over that peninsula. So, and there are a number of other areas along the coast that are sort of in the same sort of dangerous areas. This is actually some work that we were doing looking at a region right down here in Westport, Washington, where there's a school, a Costa Elementary School, that's slated to be rebuilt, and so we were doing some tsunami studies of this. They're planning on building a 2-story school there that could be used also as a vertical evacuation structure for people who don't have time to get off of the peninsula but may be able to use the school as a refuge. So that's some of the sort of work that I've been involved in. The reason we can use the code that we've developed for this kind of work and work with the state of Washington and other agencies on this sort of thing is that the code has gone through a pretty extensive validation procedure. There's something called the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program that has benchmarking workshops every few years where people who are developing tsunami codes come together and compare results from different models on a similar set of benchmark problems, and then a committee evaluates the results and sort of accredits some of the codes as being suitable for use in work that's funded by this program and therefore also by other government agencies typically. Unfortunately, when we started doing this benchmarking 3 or 4 years ago of our code, we discovered that a lot of the data that was needed to run the benchmark problems wasn't really available. It had been several years since it had been done before. A lot of the problems, no one quite knew exactly where the data was or exactly how the problems were specified. So a lot of the work of rerunning all these codes was coming up with the data again and reconstructing what was necessary in order to run the codes. So part of this project, we tried to compile all of that information together and put it on GitHub, which I'll mention later is a sort of open source platform where a lot of scientific computing code and data is being shared these days. So let me turn to the topic of reproducibility more generally. So this is something that is becoming more and more of an issue in a lot of fields of scientific computing, data science, computational science in general. There have been a number of editorials in journals like Science and Nature and the popular press and elsewhere about the lack of reproducibility and how we need to ensure that the sort of computations that we're doing can actually be repeated and that we're following the best practices of the scientific method, basically. The scientific method, which was developed in terms of observational and experimental sciences originally. When you write a paper, you had to describe what you were doing and what your tools were and what techniques you used well enough that other scientists could independently try to reproduce your results. And it's really a critical aspect of working on problems, both in terms of scientific discovery, but also in accountability if you're doing any sort of analysis that's being used to make decisions. In terms of computational science and data science, the ideas of sort of what are the best practices for making sure that results are reproducible haven't really been all that well codified, but a lot of people are thinking about this, and there's a lot of interest and a lot of projects going on that are moving in this direction. So in the experimental sciences, it's not always necessarily followed as well as it might be, but there are sort of standard procedures of using lab notebooks, making sure you have methodology sections of publications and so on. And in mathematics, in pure mathematics, say, it's essential that you publish a proof along with a theorem. If you have some new result, you can't just publish the theorem and say, well, I proved this, but I'm not going to share my proof with you. Actually, that's the way mathematicians used to work once upon a time, and then eventually they realized that wasn't going to make it because you couldn't always believe what was in publications. But in computational science, unfortunately, it's often too much the case that you read a paper that has a new method, it has some beautiful graph that shows how well it works, but you can't find all the details in the paper about exactly how it was implemented. You certainly can't get your hands on the code typically to try running it yourself. And so you just have to take the author's word for it that they actually implemented the method they say they do properly and ran the code and got the results you're looking at. This is a quote from a blog article that someone pointed me to just a few weeks ago. And it was actually about reproducible research in experimental sciences. And I sort of highlighted the first part, though, saying that if your experiment is just running numerical data through an algorithm, then releasing your code and data allows you to quickly verify that you've done what you've said you've done. But it's so much harder in the experimental sciences. But unfortunately, I mean, if only it were this easy in computational and data science. It should be easier, because once you've written the code, once you've collected your data, it's all just digital information. You can save it, but it doesn't always happen that way. Okay? So the more typical thing that happens is that I might start developing a computer program to test out a new algorithm. I decide I've got some nice results that I want to go in my paper, so I'm going to make a figure that goes in my paper. Maybe I use a GUI or some interactive MATLAB or R or whatever computer system I like to use. Python is what I usually use these days, but if you just sort of type things into the command line and make the figure, maybe you zoom in on it, get it just the way you want it, and then you print it out and save it to put in your paper, and then you go on and do something else, well, there's no way you can go back and regenerate that figure exactly. So it's a much better idea typically to write a script or a program, so at least you have a copy. But even then, what often happens is that you write the script or the program to make figure 1 in your paper, and then for figure 2, you want to implement something slightly different or try it out on a different problem. You twiddle a few parameters to get that working well, and by the time you've made figure 2, your script, your program no longer works for figure 1, and so you still don't have a good record of what you've done. Okay, so you can try to obviate that by making sure that once you've made figure 1, you save a copy of that figure. You maybe say figure1.py or whatever, if it's a Python script. But then maybe later you fiddle a little bit, and so you have figure1 underscore final.py, which is the final version you submitted. But then you change it some more, and it's no longer exactly the final version. And pretty soon you're in the situation illustrated here from PhD Comics, or final.doc. Gets looked at by the advisor, it becomes final rev2.doc, some more comments. Eventually it's final.rev22, comments 49, corrections 10. Why did I come to grad school? And you don't want to get in that situation. So, but too often that's sort of what you end up doing if you try to just keep track of versions of things sort of on the fly by this kind of approach. So there's a fairly simple solution to this problem, at least, that's pretty well developed by now, called using version control. And there's lots of version control software systems. Just to get an idea, how many people here who write computer code use version control to keep track of it? Good, that's good. If you don't, if you're writing computer code, or even if you're writing papers or grant proposals or any sort of document that you might want to go back and look at an earlier version of, or that you're collaborating with someone else and you need to merge in changes that come from more than one person, using version control is very easy these days. There's lots of good systems. I use Git's, G-I-T, which is one that's become very popular for scientific computing. This GitHub that I mentioned is sort of a public repository for hosting code that, or anything that you have under Git version control. But there's various others. There's Mercurial. There's older versions. CVS goes back decades, and then Subversion was sort of built on top of CVS, or an improved version of that. Those are what the older style ones are, what were called sort of server client models, where there was one server that had the master copy, and if you wanted to check in changes, you had to be able to connect to that server. There's various problems with that. So the newer versions like Git and Mercurial are distributed version control systems where you can clone the repository and you get the entire history of all the changes everyone has made. So with any of these systems, what happens is whenever you want to keep a snapshot of a file or a collection of files, it's very easy. You just commit the current state of your repository, maybe with some message explaining why this code has changed from the previous version, and it gives it a unique identifier, and what it stores in a database is the deltas, the difference between this and your previous version. So it's very lightweight. It doesn't take much space to keep saving all of the different versions, and it keeps track of it for you. So that's a very good place to start. If you're not using version control, it's a good place to start towards reproducibility. And it'll make your own life much simpler. And so again, a lot of the sort of debate about reproducibility deals with how do we make things open and public and be able to reproduce what other scientists have done. And there's a lot of issues with that. Some people are unwilling to share their data or their code for various reasons. But a good place to start is just with what I call sort of private reproducibility. Make sure that you can reproduce your own work next week or even 2 hours after you've done it. And as I mentioned, it's a good idea to use scripts rather than GUIs for any sort of data analysis and visualization. Version control is one good thing to start with. There are also more complicated things, provenance tracking tools that keep track of not only what version of the code, but what version of the data and what version of graphics packages or the operating system you used, and sort of have an automatic way of keeping track of what you're doing as you go along. So why do this? Well, it really does make your own life easier. You can build on your own research. If you're collaborating with other people, you can build on what they're doing. If someone working on a project leaves or graduates, you can keep working on the project. Other people can come in and pick up and see the history of what's been done. Also, even if you're just writing a paper by yourself and you think you've got everything in perfect final form, you may get referee reports back 6 months later who say, well, this is great, but the font's not big enough in Figure 1. And then you have to just make some small change. But if you no longer remember how to make Figure 1, it can take you days to recreate what you did. So it's worth doing just for your own sanity. And also, if you sort of keep track of what you're doing privately, it's somewhat like having a lab notebook. You don't necessarily have to publish a lab notebook to the whole world, but if you're a lab scientist, you're expected to keep a lab notebook that you keep safe for years after the experiment is done, so that if questions come up later, you can go back and justify what you did or reconstruct what went wrong if perhaps an error is found in your experiment years later. So it's sometimes called auditable research, that you should be able to justify what you did years later, even if you're not openly sharing what you do as you go along. So this sort of private reproducibility is a good place to start. And then that also makes it much easier down the road if you want to share your data and your code with others, whether it's readers of your paper or just researchers down the hall. If you've got this sort of private reproducibility working well, then it's relatively easy to share what you're doing with other people as well. And there are lots of reasons for doing that and for advocating that sort of thing. It makes it much easier to verify the scientific integrity of results that people get. But it also greatly helps in understanding the ideas and implementing the methods. So if I write a paper on some new computational method for solving differential equations, my hope is that people reading that paper will say, yeah, that's a good idea, I'm going to implement it, and they'll use it themselves, and then they'll cite my paper, and so on. But if they can't figure out what I did, and if it's too hard to implement it themselves, then they're not going to bother. So just in terms of getting your own work used, if our goal is to do things that become useful to people, then sharing what we've done can make it easier for people to understand what's in the code and make it easier for them to adopt it and use it themselves. The term reproducible research means a lot of different things to different people, so I think there's a whole range of things that kind of fall under this category of reproducible research. At one end of the scale is wanting to be able to maybe download somebody's code and just press a button or type make plots if you're using make files, and it runs all the code, it does all the analysis, it produces the plots, and you don't have to do anything except hit return, and everything is reproduced. So that's sort of one aspect of reproducibility. At the other extreme is wanting to just make sure there's enough details there that somebody else could, starting from scratch and reading your paper and looking at your code, implement the algorithm themselves and reproduce the fact that the method behaves in a certain way on certain class of problems, for example. And there's all sorts of things in between. And there are different aspects of difficulties that come up in trying to be reproducible in different ways. But I think sometimes people get a little too hung up on the idea of, well, this software might not run on computers 10 years from now, or this software requires some proprietary package that other people won't have, and so no one else can run it, or it requires some special supercomputer hardware that most readers won't have. So what's the point in publishing my code, because people won't be able to use it? And to me, again, I think a big part of it is just making all the details available so that someone who's trying to use the ideas that you published can really see what you did, and many of the details that don't make it into a paper can be found in the code if people have access to looking at it. But there's a lot of debate still about sort of what exactly falls under the rubric of reproducible research. There's also people use the term replicable or repeatable for various aspects of this. And it often tends to vary a lot from one field to another, depending on what terms are already used for other kinds of reproducibility or repeatability of experiments, for example. So you have to be a little careful when you're reading kind of the literature about reproducible research. So what I wanted to do now is just kind of list a few of the tools for people who aren't familiar with this field, some of the tools that are available that I would encourage you to learn more about. As I mentioned, there's a number of different version control systems, and there's a number of public hosting sites that make it easy if you have a Git repository for all of your code or for one paper or something that you're working on. You can put it on the cloud so that you can easily clone it from different computers. Can make it easier just to work on it yourself in different places. You can easily collaborate with a small number of people. If it's a private repository, you can easily make it open to the world if you want to. So there's a few listed here. GitHub and Bitbucket in particular are often used for Git code. There's other ways to archive things. If you have data or figures that you want to archive as part of a publication, some journals allow submitting supplementary materials, which is often additional figures or data sets. Some journals allow submitting code also as supplementary materials these days. And then they give it a permanent home along with the journal article that has a DOI associated with it, a digital object identifier, so people can find it permanently, more or less, in the future. There's also institutional data repositories. University of Washington has something called ResearchWorks that the library supports, where you can archive any sort of data that you want that goes along with a research project or with a paper. All PhD theses now end up being deposited in ResearchWorks eventually, for example. There's also public data repositories for particular kinds of data, Protein Data Bank and various other ones that have been developed for specific communities to archive data in a particular form in different fields. There's also something called Figshare.com. Figshare is a kind of a general place where you can deposit almost anything, slides from a talk, a single figure, data or code that goes along with the paper, videos of a lecture, anything you want can be put into Figshare, and then it gets a unique DOI where you can refer to it and people can cite it. Going a little bit beyond version control, there are also what are called workflow management systems that, as I mentioned, try to keep track of not just what version of the code, but also maybe what version of the data, if you've got different data sets, the provenance of the data, the particular version of various other software packages, visualization tools, or whatever that you might have used to make a particular result so that you can go back and determine exactly how some result, be it a figure or a table or whatever, was created. There's also a number of tools for what's sometimes called literate programming, a term that Don Knuth, I think, originally developed in terms of thinking about a program should include its own documentation as part of it. And Brad Bell here has been a long time user of some of these tools and has done a lot of his programming using these literate programming tools. But there are a number of different tools that make it relatively easy to put documentation in the code as you're writing it, and then turn that into a separate documentation package very easily that comes out associated with the code. And that can make it much easier for people to understand what you've been doing, and make it easier for your own future self to understand what you were doing when you go back and look at it later. There's also a lot of sort of notebooks and cloud-based publishing tools now that make it relatively easy to describe what you're doing in the context of writing code and analyzing data. Mathematica and Maple have had these notebooks for a long time. MATLAB has a sort of publish option now where you can embed mathematical description of what you're doing in the code and have it be published in more like a publication form. There's also a number of open source tools. If you use Python, Sage is a package of open source mostly mathematics packages in Python that William Stein here at UW in the math department has developed. IPython is a very nice shell for using Python, but there's also an IPython notebook now that's been very extensively developed in the last few years by Fernando Perez at Berkeley and others that makes it very easy to sort of incorporate text along with Python code or other languages. They've really developed it to where you can use lots of other languages besides Python as well. If you use R, then Knitter and RStudio, for example, are similar sorts of notebook systems there. Another tool that people sometimes use for making code more reproducible is what's called virtualization, or using a virtual machine. So if you have concerns that your code requires a certain set of dependencies, maybe a particular version of a graphics package and a particular compiler and so on, and you're afraid that maybe in a couple of years those aren't going to be available on your system anymore, or that other people won't have it available if they want to try to run your code, then you can use something like VirtualBox or VMware, where someone can download a player, say for VirtualBox, that will take a virtual machine and execute it and open up a environment on your own computer that mimics the environment that was used to create it. So for example, I've in classes often created a virtual machine that has a Linux distribution on it with a lot of Python tools and Fortran program compilers and other packages that we're using in the class. And then anybody in the class can use that virtual machine, regardless of what kind of computer they have, whether it's Windows or Linux or Mac. They can run VirtualBox, they can open up this virtual machine, and it opens up a Ubuntu desktop that has all of the tools that they need to run the code. And we do something similar with Clawpack. You can download a Clawpack virtual machine that has everything installed along with the Python plotting tools that we use and things like that. And these days you can also use virtual machines on the cloud, basically. There's a number of cloud computing platforms like Amazon EC2 or Windows Azure, where you can basically start up an instance in the cloud, and you can get free accounts on either of these for trying things out and running fairly small instances, or you pay by the hour, typically pennies per hour, depending on how powerful a computer you want. You can basically rent computer time as you need it. And when you start up an instance, you start it up with a particular virtual machine. So you can choose exactly which operating system you want, and you can open up a virtual machine that someone else has created that has the software you might need on it. So you can create a virtual machine on Amazon. For example, we have a Clawpack VM or AMI, Amazon Machine Image, on Amazon that anyone who wants to try out some of our test problems can just open an account on Amazon, start up this particular virtual machine, everything is installed there, and they can immediately be running things. So that's another way of sort of encapsulating what you've done in a way that makes it much more reproducible and easier for other people to use and experiment with. There are other web platforms sort of for running code that make it even easier in some ways. So there are things like Run My Code, which was designed as a place to sort of deposit code that goes along with publications in such a way that a reader can go to that website and that particular code will run very easily on the website because it's been installed in the proper way. Wakari is a sort of cloud platform for running IPython notebooks in particular. Cloud.sagemath.com, I mentioned the SAGE project at UW. This is a new sort of cloud computing platform that has just become recently available, which I'm actually using for a class I'm teaching this quarter. So a lot of the students, rather than using a virtual machine even, they're using the SageMath Cloud, and they can just basically open up a web page where they can open a terminal window, they can open an IPython notebook or a SAGE worksheet, which is sort of similar, and do all their computing there as if they were logging into another machine. And at the moment, it's all free. Anybody can create an account. And if people are interested in a quick demo of that afterwards, I'm happy to stick around and sort of show you how that works and maybe show you a little bit about how Git works as well if anyone is interested. So yeah, as I mentioned, Git is a very easy to use, well, it gets subtle if you try to do more complicated things, but at least to get started, it's quite easy these days, and there's a huge number of tutorials available on the web. I've listed a few of them here. Both GitHub and Bitbucket have sort of introductory pages on how to use Git, but there's a couple of other standard references at the top. There's a link here to a list of good tutorials. There's an online tutorial where you can just sort of create a GitHub account on the fly in a little cloud computing platform. I've also, the class I'm teaching this quarter, which is on high-performance scientific computing, last year it was recorded and put on Coursera, and they've actually just started running that Coursera class again a few weeks ago. And the first thing I teach in that class is how to use Git, and the students all have to create a Bitbucket repository, and that's how all of the homework for the quarter gets submitted, is by pushing things to their Bitbucket repository. So the first few lectures in that sort of cover getting started with Git. If you get into the sort of reproducibility idea and think this is a good idea, there's a science code manifesto online at this link down here that more than 1,000 people have endorsed at this point, which basically says it's a good idea to be sharing the code that goes along with scientific work. You're welcome to take a look at that or endorse it if you wish. There's also a nice set of slides that Lorena Barba put together on sort of a manifesto for principal investigators on how to run a lab and how to get your students and postdocs working in a reproducible manner, which is on Figshare. She put that together as part of a workshop that we had at IHME at Brown University. It's a new NSF center for, it's the Institute for Computational and Experimental Research in Mathematics. And we had a workshop on reproducibility in computational and experimental mathematics, December of 2012. And it was really a working workshop, so we had a few talks in the mornings, but the afternoons were all sort of working groups tackling various aspects of reproducibility and trying to think about best practices and what do we need to do in terms of education, how can we influence journal policies and funding agency policies and so on. So there's a final report that came out of that workshop that lists some of the things that we came up with. There's also a fairly extensive wiki of other resources and pointers to various links on reproducibility. There's another workshop that I was involved in 2011 up at UBC on reproducibility, and most of the lectures from that workshop are recorded, and there's some pretty good videos online if you're interested in looking at those. Reproducibleresearch.net also has a pretty good list of other resources that you can look at. And then there's a couple of particular papers that you might be interested in looking at on workflows and also on sort of best practices for dealing with scientific data. And then finally, let me mention that we're having a workshop at UW on May 8th on reproducibility. This is part of a new data science environment initiative that was funded by the Moore Foundation and the Sloan Foundation just recently. They got together and decided to fund a big program, about $38.5 million spread between 3 universities, UW, NYU, and Berkeley, over the next 5 years to develop infrastructure for data science. And a big part of their goal here was to develop sort of alternative career paths for people who are interested in developing software and tools more so than writing papers, and to sort of people who sometimes don't have a natural place in universities where there's so much emphasis on publishing papers and not enough emphasis on publishing tools and useful software. But they're also very interested in reproducibility. The two program managers at the Moore and Sloan Foundation that put this together were both at this workshop we had at IHME in 2012. So reproducibility is one of the big aspects of what they're interested in. And so we have it's actually an interesting project in that the 3 universities were chosen by the institutes after several rounds of white papers and site visits from a much bigger pool originally. And then we had to get together and write a joint proposal to actually get the money of how we're going to work together over the next 5 years to accomplish some of these things. So there's a number of very good people at NYU and Berkeley who are involved in all aspects of the data science initiative, but in reproducibility in particular. So there's going to be at least a few of those people will be here at UW for this workshop. Fernando Perez, who's the original developer of the IPython notebook from Berkeley, will be here. And Philip Stark, who's the chair of the statistics department at Berkeley. And Juliana Frady, who's one of the developers of this VizTrails workflow management system at NYU, will also be here. So we're going to have an interesting day, I think. Stephen Friend, who's the president of Sage Bionetworks, which has a big emphasis on sharing data as well, is going to be a keynote speaker in the morning to kind of set the stage. And then we'll have a couple panel discussions in the morning on some of the issues of sharing data and code, and a second panel on what are some of the solutions that are already around and what sort of tools exist and what sort of new things do we need. And I think Abby Flaxman will be on the one of those panels, the one on issues. So I encourage other people to come as well. So the morning will be kind of geared at introducing people to some of these ideas. And then the afternoon we'll have some breakout groups to talk more about how we're going to take our next steps in this collaboration and try to get more people on campus and elsewhere involved in this. So there's a link here to the workshop page. Please, by all means, if you're interested, come out for that. So that's about all I wanted to say, but I'd be happy to take any questions, or people want to stick around later, show you some demos. Yeah?
So this is sort of a cynical point of view, but it strikes me as there's no incentive to produce reproducible work. And, I was wondering if maybe,
Yep.
maybe in a competitive research environment there's like a disincentive. Somebody might try to destroy your
Yes, excellent question. What's the incentive for doing reproducible research when there seem to be sort of disincentives to sharing things when it can be a little cutthroat in terms of publishing things? So I think there's a couple of answers to that. I mean, one thing is I think that there is becoming more and more recognition that we need to incentivize some of these things. So hopefully some newer incentives will come along. So I was just before coming in here, I was reading my email, and someone had sent around a link to an NSF Dear Colleague letter encouraging people to apply for grants specifically on how do you generate better incentives for research products other than publications, software in particular, software and data sharing. And NSF has been paying attention to these issues and trying to work on coming up with incentives, and many of the other agencies, as I mentioned, the Moore and Sloan Foundations are very interested in this topic and see this as something where they can maybe try to kind of nudge things in the right direction. So there may be additional incentives coming down the road. But even now, I think one good incentive is, as I mentioned in my own work, I got kind of tired of writing papers where I thought I had good ideas that I was putting out there and then nobody was bothering to implement them and use them. And so as a result, no one was citing my papers either. So whereas when I started writing software, at least people started using it. And unfortunately, it's still an issue. How do you cite software and how do you get people to cite software? And so it maybe doesn't get as many citations as we might hope. But at least it gets people using the methods, and then they start citing the papers, hopefully. And in the future, I hope we'll have better ways of making sure that software gets cited in, there are various issues with citing software. Some journals don't want those in the bibliography list to begin with, but even if you're allowed to put software in your bibliography, people don't know exactly how to cite it or who to put down as the authors, and so it gets cited in lots of different ways, and then you try to search for what are all the citations, and it's almost impossible to come up with any sort of number. So there are definite issues, and that's the kind of thing this Dear Colleague letter was addressing from the NSF, I think. But there are incentives, I think, in terms of getting people to actually use what you're doing. And I've also found that as I've started to share the software that I write, that people will write to me with questions about using it. And of course, that's another fear that people have. If I put my software or my code out there, people are going to start bugging me with questions about how do I use this. And that happens to some extent. But on the other hand, if you're just posting the code that goes along with the paper, I think most people realize there's no promise of user support for most of what you find on the web these days, and code that gets posted as part of a paper. Many people are happy just to see that it's there, and if you're trying to put together software, then you have maybe a little more responsibility to actually respond to users. But on the other hand, I found that a lot of good new research comes out of it. People have an interesting problem that they're trying to tackle that the software doesn't quite work on, or that the method we developed doesn't quite work on, and then we start looking at that, and maybe we collaborate with them, and so I think there's potential for a lot more collaboration, a lot of other good science to come out of sharing things. And so I think that can be an incentive as well. Yeah, right in the back there.
To sort of go off David's point about incentives, and also to sort of go a little bit further on your point about people getting your responses back on your code, not so much about questions, but I feel that sort of a big reason why people might not publish their codes more is more about embarrassment than it is about anything else, in the sense that, you know, there's code that I've written that I don't want to publish, not because I think that it's incorrect, but because I wrote it when I barely wrote Python and it's incredibly inefficient and it's terrible.
Right.
So I'm wondering what mechanisms might be put in place to get people to share code that they've written in an understanding that, yes, the internet is often a horrible, trolly place, but also that it can really help you write better code.
Right. Yeah, good question. So the question was, people are often embarrassed to put the code they write on the internet. I am too. And in fact, if you start digging through Clawpack, you will find lots of embarrassing code that I wish we had time to sit down and clean up and make a lot prettier. So part of it is you just have to kind of get over the embarrassment factor and figure this is an important part of doing the research and documenting what you did. And if it's not beautiful, well, people will understand because most people feel the same way about their own code. And part of it is, though, I mean, when I talk to mathematics audiences, I often kind of relate sharing code with the idea of sharing the proof of a theorem. Once upon a time, mathematicians wrote papers, proved the theorem. They said, you know, this theorem is true, I proved it, and maybe if they were worried about proving it to the world later, they would make up some anagram or something that encoded the proof so that 20 years later they could prove that they actually did prove it or something. But the idea of actually publishing your proof didn't exist originally in mathematics. And now, on the other hand, you know, you can't publish a mathematics paper that says, I proved this theorem without including the proof. It just wouldn't get published. And if we were in that's still in the days when people could do that, and you started suggesting that maybe we should publish proofs, then people would say, oh, well, I'm too embarrassed to publish this proof. I mean, I'm sure it's right, but I didn't really clean it up well enough. I don't want anyone else to look at it. And all of the same sort of objections we hear about publishing code, you can kind of relate back to publishing proofs of theorems. And yet, you know, because it's accepted, people realize if you want to publish a paper, you have to spend the time to clean up the proof and make it presentable. And that's rewarded because that's part of the publication and you have to do that. So it's not like, well, I won't bother doing that, I'll just write another paper, which is unfortunately all too often what happens in the case of code. If you have the choice between cleaning up your code or writing another paper, you get more kudos for writing another paper. But if it were expected that you have to publish the code as part of it, then people would take the time to clean it up and make it presentable. And in the process, they would probably find errors, which would be a good thing. I mean, certainly when people write up proofs of mathematical theorems, very often the first proof you jotted down in the middle of the night turned out not to be right after all. And when you start writing it up for publication, you realize there are holes here and there, but you can fix them up. And in the end, you publish something that is right, or the referees maybe find more holes in it, but that's the process by which you make sure that what eventually gets published and accepted and used by the community is right. And I think in the long run, we have to get to that same point with code. It's going to take a while to get to the point where it's sort of as expected as it is in the mathematics community, but I think that's kind of the direction that things are inevitably going to move towards, probably. Yeah.
So I was wondering if you could comment on how well like version control and some of the other tools that you were talking about scale, because a lot of the projects that we work on here involve dozens of people and hundreds or thousands of pieces of code, and so even if everything's version controlled really well, it'd still be nearly impossible to reproduce.
Yeah, so how well does version control scale? I mean, for code, I think it scales pretty well. I mean, the Git system, for example, was, I think, developed by Linus Torvalds for the Linux kernel. And that's where Linux is developed, and there's thousands, tens of thousands of people working on that, and lots of people using it. And that's so there are a number of very large projects that you can find on GitHub, for example. So the whole IPython project, for example, is on GitHub, and there's dozens of contributors to that around the world and whatnot. So there's lots of big projects that are in terms of code. Another issue, though, is data, and how do you do version control for data? And that's a somewhat different issue because data sets tend to be huge, and it's harder to track what the changes are to a data set sometimes if data is changing. But I know I'm not an expert on this, but I know there's a number of groups sort of thinking about how do you do better version control for large data sets too.
In terms of like how do you manage like the dependencies between the different pieces of code? Because I think what it can be challenging sometimes is you can see, okay, these are 20 pieces of code that were all run for this project. They've run in a really specific order, and it's not obvious why. Obviously, the solution is always writing this down, but when it goes to hundreds or thousands of pieces of code, that becomes challenging.
Yeah, so if you're combining lots of different pieces of code to run something, that's where some of these workflow management systems might be useful in terms of keeping track of if you have sort of totally different pieces of software that are being glued together to run something. But if they're just different components of the same project that are all in the same GitHub repository, for example, then with Git or other version control languages, you can create different branches, so people can be developing their own branch, and then there's sort of very clear procedures for how they get merged together. And a lot of the development we do for the Clawpack project, for example, we use the sort of idea of always merging things in via pull requests. So if I want to add some new feature or fix a bug on some particular part of the code, I will create a new branch. I'll make my fix there. I'll push it up to my own GitHub repository, and then I'll issue a pull request, which is saying I want to take these changes that I've made and pull them into the master version. And that is then a publicly available website that all the other developers can go and look at. And anyone who wants to can try downloading my changes, merge it into their own copy, test it out, make sure it works on their problems. And only after someone's done that, hopefully, does it actually get merged in. And you can have a sort of a discussion as part of the pull requests about whether it's a good set of changes or whether you need to make some modifications. So that's one way, if you have sort of lots of people working on different aspects of a code, that these version control systems can help you manage that. And then you have a good record going back in time if you look at sort of past pull requests and the commit messages that were given when people merged things together to sort of keep track of exactly who made what changes at what time and why, and what different branches were merged together. But I'm not sure if I'm exactly answering the issue that you're thinking about with different codes, but yeah.
Any other question?
Yeah.
So you had mentioned that you're using GitHub and having, or you have multiple developers working on your software. When you have a large number of pull requests, like what's the management side of that like? So when you are trying to go in and deal with all these changes, how do you go about managing it, and what is the scale of the developers that you have working on this project?
Yeah, so the question is what's sort of the scale of how do you manage these projects on GitHub where you have lots of developers issuing pull requests and whatnot. And I think it depends a lot on the project, how many people are involved, and exactly what the management style is. And I'm not sure we have it all that well organized in Clawpack. It tends to be a little bit ad hoc because most of us involved are faculty who are busy with other things, or students or postdocs who are working on these things with us. And so we don't have a sort of professional management team that keeps on top of it. So who takes a look at things and merges things in? There's sort of maybe 4 or 5 of us who are fairly actively involved in we get email anytime a new pull request is made, and one of us will try to take a look at it within a few days and see if there are any issues with it, get a discussion going. Bigger projects often have a sort of clearer set of people who are assigned the job of checking out pull requests and helping to manage this. If it's only a few people working on something, then it's much easier. But once you start getting lots of people involved who are scattered around the world, it can become more challenging, definitely. Yeah. But what I will say is we started using version control only, well, less than 10 years ago, probably with the Clawpack project, and it's made a world of difference. We I can't imagine going back to the days when we didn't use version control and we tried to have half a dozen people working on different aspects of the code and keep track of who'd done what and whether a particular change that someone made to one version of the code got copied over to somebody else's version of the code and so on. So it's infinitely simpler. It still doesn't solve all your problems if you've got lots of people working on a project. You need to think carefully about how to manage all that, but it makes it a lot easier than the alternative. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little more about those literate programming tools that help with the documentation and maybe also force you to document things in a certain way or so, and just how that helps improve the process?
Yeah. So one thing that we use for the CLAWPAC documentation, a lot of software Python packages in particular use is a documentation package called Sphinx, which was originally developed to sort of take documentation in Python code, the doc string that often appears at the top of a file or at the top of a function. That's just the string that describes the function, and automatically turn that into documentation. But we use Sphinx for all sorts of other things. I even use it for writing class notes and things like that now because it's just kind of a nice way to write web pages that are hyperlinked with each other, but that also suck in the documentation from whatever Python code you're writing automatically. I've also been using the IPython notebooks quite a bit recently just as a way to sort of illustrate things. I could maybe just bring up a couple pages here would be more interesting than talking about it. Let's see if... I was going to at least show you this Sage math cloud, see if we can get onto it. Yeah, so anybody can go to this site and create an account. Just have to remember what my username is. And when you create an account and you log in, you get a list of projects. I've got a few projects here, but you can easily just create a new project. Which takes a few seconds initially. While that's working, I could maybe go in and just show you, for example, an IPython notebook that I was using in a lab yesterday. Well, it's being a bit slow. Maybe we should take other questions, and then if anyone is interested in looking at this, you can stick around and hang out.
Any other questions? Well, I guess that wraps it up. I mean, if you want to stay and look at this, I think it would be interesting. Otherwise, thank you very much for the seminar.
Well, thank you very much for coming. Yeah.